The New Orleans Saints offense isn't just in good hands when it comes to their new coaching staff, but it's now in good hands when it comes to their starting personnel as well. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. On today's episode, we took a look at the 53-man roster projection yesterday. If you missed it, go and check that out. Today, we're going to take a look at projecting starters at each position. We're going to take a look at how Jonathan Abram will keep things interesting when it comes to the safety conversation. NFL.com's Greg Rosenthal projects a surprising starter at right tackle, not named Trevor Penning nor Taliesin Fuanga. We're going to dive into that. And to kick us off, the New Orleans Saints offensive skill positions look like they're in pretty good hands. You just have to look at them a certain way. We got that coming up for you. And much more on today's episode of Locked On Saints. We appreciate you very much for making us your first listen of the day every day, and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. The MLB and the WNBA continue to roll along, but still some more stuff to check out over when it comes to sports as well. And right now, FanDuel is hooking up everybody, all customers, with a booster bonus daily. All you got to do is head over to fanduel.com/lockedon to get started and learn more. I want to take a look at offensive starters when it comes to the skill position players for the New Orleans Saints. We'll dive into the trenches after that. Then we'll get into the defensive second and third levels, kind of just like we broke down our 53-man roster yesterday. And my focus when it comes to the skill position players, including quarterback, I know quarterbacks, is it skill position, is it not? Doesn't matter. We're looking at quarterback and the skill position players. Running back, wide receiver, Taysom Hill, and tight ends. That's kind of the way we're going to look at this. And it's really interesting to me because there's two different ways for you to look at the New Orleans Saints starters, okay? And one of them makes me feel a little bit more comfortable than the other, and one of them might make you feel more comfortable than the other, even if it's not the same one. So let's take a look at both of these possibilities. There's two different ways to look at the Saints starting offensive skill position players. Quarterback Derek Carr, running back Alvin Kamara, wide receivers Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, and then go to two tight ends, Juwan Johnson and Taysom Hill. We'll include Taysom Hill in that conversation. Obviously, Foster Moreau's in that conversation as well. But let's just use the Taysom of it all, since we expect him to be a much larger presence in this New Orleans Saints offense. So that's the two tight end, two wide receiver, one running back set. That's a 12 personnel set. Now, we expect the Saints to do a lot of this. We also expect the Saints to have a lot of three wide receiver sets, though. When we talk about doing a lot of two tight end sets, we're talking about like 20% and above, right? So if you do 20% that, and then you do, less than 10% of a bunch of other ones, you're probably still out there 40 to 50% of the time with three wide receivers. That then would look like quarterback Derek Carr, running back Alvin Kamara, wide receivers Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, and then either A.T. Perry or Cedric Wilson, and then tight end Juwan Johnson, assuming he's ready to start the season. You could also say that Taysom Hill's that person. You could also say that Foster Moreau's that person. So it's interesting. There's a couple different ways to look at what the Saints skill position players will look like, because there's a lot of conversation that goes on, and we've done it here on the show, around who's going to be the third wide receiver. And just to remind you of my stance on that, the way that I look at it is, if you're looking for your third receiver to be an outside perimeter threat, it's A.T. Perry. But on snaps where you're looking for your third receiver to be a slot guy, then it's Cedric Wilson. Because no matter what, you're going to have Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. The thing I'm most interested in watching with this New Orleans Saints offense under new offensive coordinator Klint Kubiak is how often or how seldom guys like Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed come off the field. We saw that a lot over the course of the past couple of years. Big key situations where Andy Dalton's throwing to a pair of routes being run by Kirk Merritt and Taysom Hill when the game's on the line. When you're trying to extend a drive to keep the ball out of Tom Brady's hands. Not a great decision. Do we see something different in 2024? The example that I used, of course, was from 2022. But do we see something different in 2024? Do we see Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed on the field most snaps, like not coming off the field in improper situations where you feel like they need to be on the field, in favor of Equanimeous St. Brown, Bub Means, these types of guys who aren't bad players? They're just not your star caliber guys like Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed are. And yes, maybe I shouldn't go so far as to like emblazon Rashid Shaheed with the star tag, but he's a star for the New Orleans Saints offense. He might not be a household name yet, although he definitely helped his profile naturally by becoming an All-Pro and Pro Bowler last year. Sure didn't hurt. But in 2024, he has a real opportunity to take it to a whole nother level. I'm not going to do it this time. I'm not going to do the Keegan-Michael Key this time. So that's why I say, like, those are your guys. Those are your go-to dudes, right? Then what also gets really interesting is, like, what's the combination you would prefer to see on a 2 tight end set? And obviously it's going to change based on game situation, down and distance, stuff like that. But would you prefer to see Juwan Johnson and Taysom Hill? Would you prefer to see Juwan Johnson and Foster Moreau? Would you prefer to see Foster Moreau and Taysom Hill? Where does Dallin Holker fit into all that if he does indeed make the roster? Although I wouldn't consider him a starter. So there's a lot of really interesting things that the Saints can do here when you look at their starting skill position players and then all the guys that they can rotate in, but rotating them in more selectively, doing it with a little bit more, I guess, with a little bit more, I don't want to call it proactivity, but maybe pragmatism of understanding the realistic situation here, right? We have to move the ball, let's say, is what the New Orleans Saints are thinking. It's 3rd and 7. You're up 6 points. It's the 4th quarter, 1 minute, 52 seconds left. You need that first down. You should not run that play without Chris Olave, Alvin Kamara, Rashid Shaheed, Taysom Hill on the field. And then you can pencil in whoever else you want on the field there. Maybe it's Juwan Johnson and then, is that too many players if I do one more? Yeah, it's too many players if I do one more. So, you pencil in Juwan Johnson, you can throw Cedric Wilson out there, however it is that you want to do it, right? 2 tight ends, 2 running backs, or 2 wide receivers. Or 3 wide receivers, excuse me. And so I think that, like, a big part of the conversation around why I feel like, okay, well, the Saints are actually in pretty good hands is that, like, they have a pretty intriguing group of any of those players, as long as those core players, I would say Alvin Kamara, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, and Taysom Hill, are also on the field. You know what I mean? And then build around that combination of 4 with that second tight end, that 3rd wide receiver, or that second running back. So I feel like you're in a pretty good spot there. And look, you're going to have to take Alvin Kamara off and put Jamal Williams in, take Alvin Kamara off, put Kendrick Miller in. You don't want to run Alvin Kamara ragged throughout the season. And really, what we see typically from these Shanahan-style, wide zone-style offenses is that the lead back is getting maybe 40% of snaps, 50% of snaps. You want to keep this as evenly split amongst 3 guys in a committee as possible. So that would be another thing that would factor in. But I think the Saints they're in pretty good hands when it comes to their starters. I think that there's questions for who do you go to behind the wide receivers. There's questions, who do you go to if you continue to deal with injuries at tight end? There's questions if you end up having an injury at your starting running back with Alvin Kamara. Can Jamal Williams shoulder the load? Can Kendre Miller step up in his second season? All those other things. But outside of that, the starting spots are all in good hands, including quarterback Derek Carr. I mean, it's good. It's good. You know what I mean? Is it going to win you games? We'll find out in terms of this entire group. But man, I think that they're in a good spot to start, at least at this point. Tomorrow, though, we're going to talk about how they can even improve more, because there's still some talent out there that this team could absolutely use at some of these very positions. Coming up next, NFL.com's Greg Rosenthal projected a surprise starter on the New Orleans Saints offensive line. I want to dive into that as we take a look at the starters on the trenches, both offense and defense. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. The NBA Finals are over. The NHL Finals are now over, going all the way to a Game 7. What a game, by the way. We take a look now over with our friends at FanDuel, and there's still a ton more that you can get in on, because FanDuel doesn't just give you the NBA and the NHL and the NFL. They give you even more. You can find it all over at FanDuel.com/lockedon. And especially right now, this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. That means that there's something to bet on every day all summer long. Tonight, you got the New York Liberty and the WNBA 4-point favorites. You can bet on that. You can get in on much more. You can get in on some NFL futures. Who's going to be the Super Bowl champion? Who's going to be Offensive Rookie of the Year? They have all of that over at FanDuel. You can even get in on week 1. New Orleans Saints favored 4.5 right now up against the Carolina Panthers. Go and check it out over at FanDuel.com/lockedon so you can start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, family. The New Orleans Saints were projected to have a surprise starter at right tackle, not named Trevor Penning nor named Taliesin Fuanga. Let's take a look at what Greg Rosenthal had to say as we take a look at our starters on the New Orleans Saints trenches. So we're going to go offensive line and defensive line here in this portion of the show. We appreciate you very much for making us your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to also go and check out Locked On Sports Today, 24/7 stream over on YouTube. All the biggest stories from around the world of sports programmed specifically to hit every single one of them every day with the people that know the teams the best, not the people that are covering them from afar. So make sure you go and check it out over at Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app as well. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Greg Rosenthal threw me for a loop. And I respect Greg. I love Greg's work. He's awesome. But he threw me for a loop, he threw me for a loop. It's no but about it. And he threw me for a loop. When he did his starter projections for the NFC South, including the New Orleans Saints, he and I agreed on 4 of 5. Okay. Taliesin Fuanga, Nick Saldiveri at left guard. Sorry, that's left tackle, left guard. Sorry, my apologies. Left tackle, Taliesin Fuanga. Left guard, Nick Saldiveri. Center, Eric McCoy. Right guard, Cesar Ruiz. The last two being the chalk guys, right? That's easy. But at right tackle, where I at least currently have Trevor Penning penciled in because that's where the Saints are presently working him. Remember, yesterday's 53-man roster projection was more about, hey, here's where the state of the roster is right now, not necessarily, hey, here's the right answer. But a little bit more courageous is Greg Rosenthal than I, listing Landon Young as a starting right tackle. Now, he's done it before. Remember, Landon ended up starting in place of Ryan Ramczyk a couple years ago at right tackle against the Philadelphia Eagles and held up well. He also has another couple of starts at that position as well. Struggled a little bit in times where he's been asked or called into action on the interior, but played like okay over on the right tackle spot. Not of significant detriment. You know what I mean? Like serviceable dude, really, really smart, really, really intelligent guy. He gets it. He knows how to play these positions. So I thought it was really interesting because this effectively is projecting one of two things, and I'll be able to tell you which one because as Greg does, he's thorough, so he actually gives an explanation for this too. So we don't just have to like read it and be like, oh, I wonder what he was thinking. He actually tells us. But it would project one of two things. One of which is that Trevor Penning just doesn't pan out, which would be, that would stink. You know what I mean? Like that would just be rough. If didn't work out at left tackle, they move him over to right tackle. That doesn't work out either. And then now all of a sudden you spent the first round pick that you traded, moved around so many assets for in order for you to get your backup tackle. That last year wasn't even able to get out on the field as the 6th option. Or let me rephrase that. Last year wasn't put out on the field to even be the 6th option. That might not be Trevor Penning's fault. That just may be the way that the Saints saw it all shake out. The other thing is another injury for Trevor Penning, which we're going to cross our fingers and knock on wood that that's just simply not the case. I'll read what Greg wrote here, which I think is astute, and I do agree with. For now, 2022 first-round pick Trevor Penning is trying the right side after struggling to get on the field last year. It's uncertain if mainstay Ryan Ramczyk will continue to play football because of his knee injuries. So I think that the projection here is based on like, he's trying something new. We don't really know yet. So I'm going to pencil in the guy that we've actually seen play the position before. Oh, but I can't because that's Ryan Ramczyk because we're not even sure if he's going to play football again. So who's the next guy after that? Landon Young. You know what I mean? I think that like it's a perfectly logical process. What's the phrase? Process of elimination or whatever. It's like process of elimination or whatever. I think that makes sense. But it could be really interesting if, gosh, like that's a big time kind of kick in the gut if you're the New Orleans Saints and Trevor Penning can't get out there starting for you at right tackle. But right now, I'm penciling in Trevor Penning as a starter at right tackle because that's what we have seen so far. We've seen no delineation away from that thus far. OTAs, mandatory minicamp, no change. It was always Taliesin Fuaga at left tackle, Trevor Penning at right tackle. Nobody came in for either one of them. That's what we saw. So that's what I'm going to project for right now, but could be very interesting. And thankfully, the Saints do have a player like Landon Young that they could fall back on if they needed to. All right, let's take a look at the defensive line here. We'll go edge. I think I'll make the argument that your starters, as defined by being the first two players to take the field at the edge position, will be defensive end Cameron Jordan and defensive end Carl Granderson. The only reason why I don't put Chase Young in there is because I imagine he'll maybe not play as heavy a rotation early in the season as he will play later in the season, coming back from the neck procedure, all those other things. B, 1st and 10, first play of the season, probably a run play. You know what I mean? And that's more Cam Jordan's territory. Although Chase Young is effective against the run, this is what the New Orleans Saints love guys like Cam Jordan and Carl Granderson for, is because of their ability to defend the run. And Carl Granderson has been the team's best run defender for, I think, 2 years running now. So that's the only reason why I say that. But look, it's going to be a heavy rotation for Chase Young. I've even made the argument in a previous episode that Chase Young has the ability to match or exceed Cam Jordan's season snap percentages. Okay? Season snap percentages, which means playing on the field with him at the same time, or being on the field at the same time with him, being on the field at the same time as him and Carl Granderson, and there being times where he's on the field when Cameron Jordan is not on the field. And that number might tick up in terms of percentages of either or way later on in the season, which might end up going Chase Young's way by the time that it's all said and done, with how many snaps he's also taken in addition to those guys. So that's what I look at when it comes to the starters, Cam Jordan, Carl Granderson, because that's who will probably get the first and 10 defensive start at the beginning of the season. And then we'll see where things go from there. Defensive tackle, I think, is going to be a little bit different than last year. The Saints' two core starters at defensive tackle last year, if you really look at it, were majority of the season Colin Saunders and Nathan Shepard, the two veterans, with Bryan Bresee being the rotational player, even though he was heavily rotated in. And of course, those snaps increased throughout the season. But I think this year it's Colin Saunders and Bryan Bresee. I think Bryan Bresee looked really, really good his rookie season, even in this very same projection piece where Greg Rosenthal has Landon Young starting at right tackle for a little bit of a wrinkle. He mentions that Bryan Bresee, he loved what he saw from his rookie season and that he has the ability to become a star in 2024. And I think that that's true. I completely agree. And again, I think with Colin Saunders, he has an ability to take a step forward as well. When he and I talked at one point last season, one of the things that he talked about was like, look, this first season is all about learning the defense, understanding what our responsibilities are, understanding how to fill those out and how to execute those at the quickest way possible without wasting any time, all that other stuff. Then when he gets settled in the system, then it became, here's where I can start adding some ornamentation, doing a little bit extra, utilizing little moves to showcase my athleticism, all those other things. So I think that Colin Saunders has the ability to take a pretty good step forward in 2024, along with Bryan Bresee, which could be huge for the New Orleans Saints. Like, if you really think about it, number 22 last year against the run, and the defensive interior should improve here in 2024. That's going to help drastically. The New Orleans Saints, less than 40 sacks for the first time since 2017. And even when the Saints went up, even when the NFL went up to a 17-game season, the Saints were typically reaching 40 sacks within the first 16 games. Getting additional pressure from the interior helps a ton in that metric, because you can get those sacks from those players on the interior. Closest distance between point A and point B is a straight line. Okay, here's your one tech, here's your zero tech, rushing right up the middle, straight line to the quarterback. That makes sense. But also, even if that guy doesn't get the sack, but can move the quarterback off of his spot, it makes the arc that the edge rusher has to run not as deep. Takes away some of the depth there. Gets him off of his spot, gets the quarterback moving to an area where could be a tight end, but where the edge protection isn't ready to block or isn't expecting to block. Boom, sacks helps. See what I mean? So I think in all areas, if your defensive interior improves, so too does your defense as a whole. So that's what we're looking at here when it comes to defensive starters in the trenches, and then what could be a surprise over in the offensive line. But I'm sticking with the chalk and Trevor Penning. All right, coming up next, safety Jonathan Abrams is going to make that defensive backfield conversation really, really, really interesting. here over the course of training camp. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints, second and third levels of their defense, both have really all three, safety, linebacker, and cornerback, all have some pretty interesting conversations going on in 2024. But to me, the one that will be most immediately answered goes all the way back to safety, thanks to veteran safety, Johnathan Abram. We appreciate you very much for making Locked On Saints part of your day. Don't forget, we're going to be back here with you on tomorrow's episode, because we are your team every day tomorrow, where the Saints could still add talent, starting with some more changes on the offense. I think that's a spot where the New Orleans Saints could still add some talent. So we're going to take a look at who those players are, where those spots are, what the options are out there. And we're also going to take a look at players that could serve a big role from the practice squad to wrap up that episode as well, just to kind of put a real finishing touch on our 53-man roster projection episode as well. All right, so I think the New Orleans Saints have very interesting conversations. One very interesting conversation at all three positions, linebacker, cornerback, and secondary, that make up the second and third levels. I want to start off with safety, because that's the one that I think is most interesting, because it's the one that is most likely to shift from 2023 to 2024. Linebacker's interesting, but you kind of already know where things are going there. Cornerback's interesting, but you kind of already know where things are going there. Safety, you still need to figure out who that safety is going to be next to Tyrann Mathieu. It looks like it's going to be Johnathan Abram. Okay. And I think that's a good thing. I'm not saying that as like I guess it'll just be Johnathan Abram. Like, that's fine. More than fine. Like, go back and watch the last two games of last season. Week 17 up against Tampa. Week 18 up against Atlanta. And you can watch the ending, you can skip the ending, whatever you want to do. But defensively, the communication, the clarity of roles, it was just so well orchestrated with Tyrann Mathieu and Johnathan Abram as the two safeties. There were moments where Johnathan Abram was a middle of the field safety, but typically that was either in a cover 3 look or a cover 2 look, where he's still splitting those deep coverage responsibilities with other players. He only spent about 40% of the time doing that, though, while Tyrann Mathieu spent over 70%, 71% covering the middle of the field. Meanwhile, Johnathan Abram played over 50% of his snaps in those two games playing down, either in the slot, had a couple of snaps where he was technically playing out wide, and then had a lot of snaps where he was playing in the box. And that role worked so well for Johnathan Abram. He wasn't really asked to cover an entire field. He wasn't asked to go sideline to sideline. He was asked to play to his strength, which is be a downhill thumper, big hit, run supporter that can cover the middle of the field and understands how to send people from zone to zone and communicates incredibly well. That is something I don't think that Johnathan Abram gets credit for, is how well he communicates. You can see it the whole game. Him and Tyrann communicating not just with each other, but seeing things from afar and then passing that down to the linebackers, which then has to get passed down to the defensive line. And these guys are just orchestrating the heck out of that defense. And it looked so clean because of that. You noticed very few penalties. You noticed very few blown coverages, if there were any at all. And a big time spike in takeaways. Now, Tyrann Mathieu gave an impassioned speech the week leading into that final Tampa Bay game, where he put it on the secondary that they have to set the tone for this team. And everybody rose to the occasion. Alontae Taylor rose to the occasion, Paulson, Isaac Yiadom, Tyrann rose to the occasion himself, and Johnathan Abram absolutely rose to the occasion. He was responsible for 3 different turnovers, or took part in 3 different turnovers. Outstanding game. And then that was followed up by another really strong game against Atlanta. Now, Johnathan Abram is going to make the conversation interesting. And Jordan Howden's going to help, because my understanding is that Jordan Howden, they do want to get a look at what he can do in the box. They like what he can do as a deep safety behind Tyrann Mathieu already, but they want to get a better look at what it is that he might be able to do, or how he might be able to contribute as a box safety in addition to Tyrann Mathieu. And he's got the build to do it. Jordan's a big dude, like big dude. And so him playing down in the box physically looks like it will work. It just he doesn't have a lot of experience doing that in Minnesota, where he was asked to play far away or in the slot in those types of situations. So it'll be very interesting to see if he's going to be able to compete with Jonathan Abram, who has been like molded and built to play this role since his Mississippi State days, going to the Raiders, and then now showing up here in New Orleans, where he's actually being utilized back in that way that made him the asset that he began in the NFL to be. But I just think it's going to be very interesting to watch. It's going to be not interesting to watch. It's going to be exciting to watch. Like, that position battle is going to be so much fun to watch out in California. So very much looking forward to seeing that. And of course, bringing you all the updates on it every single day. So we'll see which way they go there. I'm projecting right now Tyrann Mathieu and Jonathan Abram. Funny enough, Greg Rosenthal has Tyrann Mathieu and Jordan Howden penciled in. So he sees that competition there just like I do. Or he sees that there is a competition there just like I'm explaining. Let's jump down to linebackers here, because this is another one that's kind of a bigger conversation, but unlikely to really change. Demario Davis, Pete Werner, if you're looking at a 2 linebacker set. But again, I think you're going to see more 3 linebacker sets. Demario Davis, Pete Werner, Willie Gay, they're going to be on the field a lot. The thing that's most interesting to me, too, is how down and distance changes what those nickel packages look like. Nickel packages meaning 5 defensive backs. And typically, in order for you to get 5 defensive backs on, you've got to take one of those linebackers off. It's typically the way that teams do it. You could go 3 down linemen, keep 3 linebackers, and then go 5 defensive backs. Absolutely. It's a dime look, 3-3-5. Definitely a way that you can go. But the Saints typically go 4-2-5. 4 down linemen, 4 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, and then 5 defensive backs. And so I think right now it's still going to be Demario Davis, Pete Werner. They're going to be holding that down. But look, obvious passing situation, maybe it's Willie Gay. Obvious run situation, maybe it's Pete Werner. It might completely depend upon what it is that the Saints feel that they need to do. So, or what they feel will most best match up to the situation and the down and distance. So we'll see which way they go with all of it. But I think right now, Demario Davis, Pete Werner, I'm still penciling in as my starters. And then finally, at corner, my starters are Paulson, Adebo, and Marshon Lattimore on the outside. I didn't say them in that order for any reason in particular. Marshon Lattimore, Paulson, Adebo on the outside. And then I'm going to give Alontae Taylor the slot still for now. But man, he's going to get some competition with Kool-Aid for sure. Yeah, I talked about how big Jordan Howden is. Kool-Aid looks like jacked, like ready to go. And that in the slot could be really interesting because you need to be physical there. You have to be very physical there. And Kool-Aid's one of the more physical guys, but so is Alontae. Alontae had one of the best years in 2023 when it came to press man coverage out of any of the corners in the NFL. So both of them physical, both of them high confidence, both of them high energy guys. And so I still have Alontae penciled in there, but I do think Kool-Aid's going to get his opportunity to compete both on the outside and in the slot. Greg Rosenthal has Kool-Aid McKinstry starting in the slot and writes out Alontae Taylor as being miscast in the slot last season, which I agree with. Now let's see if him doing it for a second year moves him out of miscasting and moves him into be casting correctly. And then also said it's still possible that Taylor could be dealt to a cornerback needy team. Maybe something to watch there. But I do know that the New Orleans Saints love having 4 starting caliber cornerbacks, just like they had last year in Isaac Yiadom. And you have to be ready for something to potentially happen with Marshon Lattimore midseason if things aren't going well for the New Orleans Saints or in the offseason too. So I think having those 4 guys makes a ton of sense for the New Orleans Saints. So there you go. That's all of our starters all across the roster for the New Orleans Saints. If you didn't catch the 53-man roster episode, just go back to yesterday's show right there for you. Coming up tomorrow, now we're going to take a look at where this team can still improve and what their practice squad could look like in terms of key contributors that could end up in that area. We got that all coming up for you on tomorrow's episode. We appreciate you very much for making us your first listen of the day every day. Make sure you go and check out for your second listen today, Matt Moscona over at Locked On LSU, Jake Madison over at Locked On Pelicans. Thank you for making Locked On Saints part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you. FanDuel, make every moment more. Still got the MLB,